the topic of this lecture, or this module, is various topics in what's called meta-ethics. So you can think of ethical philosophy as divided into several branches. So the first branch which you're probably very familiar with is what's called normative ethics. So normative ethics corresponds in LD roughly to the framework debate. So or like the value criterion. It tells us what in general we should follow. So like, should we follow the categorical imperative if you're a Kantian? Should we follow like maximizing expected well-being if you're a utilitarian? All of these are different examples of normative ethical theories. They give us rules to follow in order to act morally. Another branch that you might be familiar with in LD is what's called applied ethics. So if this is the framework, if this is like the framework debate or like a value criterion, then this is roughly the contention of a case. So it's where you take your normative ethical theory and then you apply it to some concrete situation. So, for example, is everyone familiar with or is anyone not familiar with the trolley problem? Or like raise your hand if you're not familiar with the trolley problem, or like don't know what it is.
Ask me a question. Ask me for it.
Oh, okay, so like, I won't ask that now, but like, that's an example of applied ethics. So, like if you're at a train track and there's a trolley hurtling towards 5 people, should you switch the trolley to go onto another track that will kill 1 person? That's an example of a concrete situation where you might apply an ethical theory and where you'd get different answers. And LD resolutions are much like this as well, because they obviously draw upon broader philosophical theories like util and deontology, but they're applied to a concrete situation, like whether Japan ought to amend its constitution. So the final branch that I'll be talking about here is meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is not that commonly used meta-ethics aren't that commonly used in LD anymore, because, well, framework debate has been kind of declining, but what meta-ethics are is they describe kind of the various assumptions that normative ethical theories will make. So here are some examples. One is is what's called axiology, or like what value is and how it works. So for example, is value important independently of people valuing it, or does its value just depend on people? So like, it seems that the value of chocolate depends on different people valuing it, right? Because some people like chocolate, some people dislike chocolate. But is moral value, like happiness or whatever, something that's valuable independently of people? Another example, or actually I'll get into the topic now, which will give 2 examples of other meta-ethical problems. So does anyone have questions so far? All right, so we'll be discussing 2 different disputes in meta-ethics. The first one is realism versus anti-realism. So realism is the view that is the view that there are moral facts. So there are some things that are right and some things that are wrong, independently of any people thinking that they're right or wrong, whatever. Whether it's like that God said that this thing is wrong and this thing is right, or whether it's just a fact about the world. So can anyone think about like, would utilitarianism be a realist theory versus an anti-realist theory which says that there are no moral facts, or that they're false, or something like that? Why is that?
Because there's concrete value in pleasure, and pain is always bad.
Yeah, exactly. So it says that independent of any of our valuing it, pleasure is intrinsically good, pain is intrinsically bad. What about, yeah, okay, so we can see that there are realist theories and there are also anti-realist theories. In this lecture, I'll be mostly going into this because most of the frameworks that you see in LD are realist, i.e. they assume that there are some things that are absolutely right, some things that are absolutely wrong, independent of people. Alright, the next one is cognitivism versus non-cognitivism. I'll get into this more later, but roughly cognitivism is the view that that statements about morality, such as like any LD resolution or saying like you ought to go to the store or something like that, these are all, their primary function is to describe something, namely our moral obligations. So if I say like murder is bad, that's describing some property about murder, i.e. its badness. Moral non-cognitivism, on the other hand, says that instead of moral sentences, saying something about or describing anything about like murder or whether Japan ought to amend its constitution, instead its primary function is to get you to do something. So if I say murder is bad, it's not trying to state any property about murder. I'm instead just trying to get you to stop murdering. Does that distinction, or does anyone have questions about that distinction so far? Okay. So let's start with anti-realism. So the way that you'll mostly see anti-realism presented in LD debate is through what's called moral skepticism. So moral skepticism in its various forms in LD says that either moral facts don't exist, so like straight up anti-realism, or that we can't access moral facts. So for some reason, we wouldn't be able to tell whether a given moral fact is true or false. For example, whether murder is wrong or not. Either that we can't access them or that they don't exist. Or maybe that everything, that they do exist, but just everything happens to be permissible. So like, instead of saying murder is bad, we would instead say like murder is okay. Does anyone have questions about moral skepticism so far, like just the basic definition? Okay. Alright, so I'll get into some arguments for moral skepticism. The first one the first two are from this guy named Mackey. So he had two main arguments. The first is the argument from disagreement. So have you ever, well, probably many of you, or have any of you encountered when someone says like, oh, morality is subjective because people disagree all the time about what we should do? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so have most of you encountered that? Okay, so this is one of the arguments he uses to argue against the existence of moral facts, or that morality could ever tell us what to do or not. It's because throughout history and throughout many different cultures, we disagree a lot on what we should do. For example, some cultures think that, or at least thought that human sacrifice is good, whereas other cultures thought that that is absolutely terrible and you should never do it. And different cultures think that like slavery is good, whereas others think that it's morally terrible. So all of these demonstrate that there is widespread disagreement over what our moral obligations are, and what is good and what is bad. Mackey argues that this means that, or the best explanation for this, is not that just some have it right, some have it wrong, but really there is no fact of the matter. We're just arguing over, basically varying opinions, where there is no deeper truth. Because he points out there is really no way to resolve these disputes. At their root, they all come down to varying moral intuitions. For example, some people might find intuitively that they should follow a certain god who says that they should give human sacrifices, whereas other people might not have that intuition and instead have the intuition that you should never murder people. In which case, there's really no way to resolve this, right? There's really no way that you can get at what the deeper truth is, because it's just two people's conflicting opinions. And so moral facts cannot really exist, at least independently of people. Also, yeah, feel free to raise your hand whenever you have a question. All right, the second one is moral oddity, or in Mackey's word, the argument from queerness, which is that moral facts are really weird. So let me give you some examples. So if I say that you ought not murder, it's supposed to somehow, well, first of all, it's supposed to somehow motivate you to do something, right? If I were to just, unlike a sentence like saying, it's sunny outside, that's not supposed to motivate you to do anything. It's just supposed to describe something. You're just supposed to think, hey, cool, it's sunny outside. Maybe I will want to go outside later. But its primary function is not to like motivate you to do anything. Whereas moral facts, they're not only supposed to make you think something, i.e. that like you should not murder people, but it's also supposed to motivate you to in order to do that. So in order to not murder people. But that seems kind of weird. It would make moral sentences completely unique. And so that's just one example of how they are very weird. The second is that somehow we're supposed to access moral facts and things about morality, like murder is bad, through not any of our senses. Like, if I were to say it's sunny outside, I would be able to tell that like by feeling it, right? Because of the warmth. I can see the sun, or that it's really bright outside. And there are various other means by which I can know it. And it seems that many of the things that we know can be accessed this way. But the problem with moral facts is, like, what sense can you use to, like, figure out that murder is bad? Does anyone have an answer for, like, could you see that murder is bad? Or hear it? Or taste it? Or anything like that? Yeah, so the answer is you can't really. We're supposed to somehow have some special way of getting that certain moral things, or that certain things are moral and certain things are not moral, through something entirely different from anything else we would get, or from the way that we would derive any other fact. We can't use the scientific method or anything like that in order to derive morality, so it seems that there's really no place that we could get it. All of these demonstrate that probably moral facts are not legitimate facts. They're not real things because they are really so odd. Does anyone have questions so far about that? Oh, I can also wait this. What's it called? All right. So if not, the second argument, which is the evolutionary argument against realism. This is by someone named Sharon Street. All right, so her argument is that at its root, morality comes down to certain moral intuitions. Wait, actually, first of all, can someone explain what moral intuitions are? Does anyone have any idea? Like, you can just take a shot at it.
Stuff that we just like think is good and bad, like what they're good and bad.
Yeah, exactly. So things that we think are good and bad, but we can't really justify why they are good and bad. And it seems that all moral theories at their base come down to certain moral intuitions. So like, what would be one moral intuition upon which utilitarianism relies?
Pleasure is good.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a certain intuition. Like, to my knowledge, or at least I've never read a utilitarian that was able to give a full deductive argument for why pleasure is good or pain is bad. They can just say, or I mean, at least none that would, yeah, so they would, all that they do is describe that we think that pleasure is good, pain is bad, but really that's just a universal, like, shared intuition. So at their base, it seems that most of these theories, or at least realist theories, come down to certain moral intuitions. Street's argument is that evolution shaped these intuitions. So is everyone familiar with natural selection? Okay, yeah, so under natural selection, of course, if you are not as fit to survive, if you don't have the tools to survive, you'll die off and therefore won't pass on your genes. That means Street thinks that some of the genes that were most beneficial, or some of the attitudes that we have that are most beneficial to our survival, are moral intuitions. For example, why might it be good to, well, like, do you all agree that it seems intuitively wrong to, like, murder your family, or if you were to have children, to murder your children? Yeah. So how would that be beneficial evolution, like in evolution?
I guess it causes propagation. I mean, if you kill your children, then you're not going to be able to pass on your defective gene or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, you're not doing a very good job, like, putting your genes into the gene pool if you're killing your children who will carry your genes to the next generation. And a lot of other things, for example, lying could hurt cooperation between different people that will help your survival. So it seems that a lot of our moral intuitions can be very, very well explained by their evolutionary benefits. So why it would be good for us as, in natural selection. In that case, it seems that we don't need to appeal to like external moral facts like realism does. Because realism assumes that there are just facts out there floating around in the world. But we can give an alternative explanation, which is at least as convincing that it's not really that our moral intuitions and moral theories do not really come from any facts out there, but instead come very directly just from our evolution. And therefore, that poses a very big problem for realism, because realism thinks that there's like a one-to-one correspondence between our intuitions and like what is true morally. However, if our intuitions are also affected by evolution, then it seems that evolution will have distorted our moral intuitions. Sorry, that was a little bit convoluted. Can anyone explain it back? Do you think?
If there's no way to know if it's like actually like that what we think is evolutionarily moral is actually moral, because like maybe like something that is helping us evolutionarily is actually wrong, like morally wrong, but we wouldn't be able to know that.
Yeah, exactly. And this can be very effective when combined with Mackey's one of Mackey's moral oddity arguments, in that we have no way of getting information about what is true morally or false morally, or like what's good and bad, right? Since we can't sense it in any way. In that case, it seems extremely unlikely that that our moral intuitions correspond to anything that's true morally, because we would have no way of getting from like moral facts out there into our intuition in our brains. And instead, the easiest explanation for how we got those moral intuitions is just via natural selection. So does anyone have questions about these two arguments? Yeah, I'd recommend asking them now if you have any doubts whatsoever, because I'll be moving on to arguments against skepticism. Okay. Yeah.
So if you like prove that there is like some like that it is intuition that like is what determines our like moral like what we do ethically, then why would that just not develop the framework like util that says that like intuitively, like I guess the phenomenal introspection argument about how like intuitively we always, or like the Moen argument, like biologically we always like pleasure more than pain.
Wait, sorry, can you repeat the first part?
If it's true that like, well, if you prove that this is true and that you need to rely on your intuitions and also your senses, why does that not just devolve into like utilitarian theories of like pleasure always being biologically preferable?
Well, yeah, it might devolve to those theories, but the point is that those intuitions are flawed. Like, this is what these arguments prove. So yes, maybe our intuitions would lead us to a certain ethical theory, whether it's deont or util or anything else. But the point is the intuitions upon which those theories are based are not realistic. questions? Alright, now we can go into arguments against moral skepticism. Can anyone think of one that would come to mind?
Moral skepticism is a no-risk issue, so presuming that like moral skepticism is false isn't actually going to do anything bad, but presuming that it's true, if there are moral facts, makes us more likely to take immoral actions.
Yeah, so this is what's sometimes called Pascal's wager, and well, in theology, it's dealing with a slightly different problem. But the basic idea is that, let's say that you're 1% sure that morality does exist, and that moral skepticism is false, and that maybe util is true. So you're 1% sure that util is true, but you're 99% sure that moral skepticism is true and that util is false. And let's say now you're in the trolley problem. Okay, so, the trolley, sorry for this drawing, it's heading down the track, it's gonna kill 5 people. Alright, sorry, this is a very rudimentary drawing. Alright, you're here, and you can pull the lever. So, okay, so the trolley's
Beautiful drawing.
And you can say that forever.
Alright, so you're 1% sure that util is true. So if util is true, you should switch the track, right? Okay, so 1% chance that we should switch the track. Okay, but we're 99% sure that moral skepticism is true. And what would moral skepticism say we should do? So the choices are either we switch the track, we don't switch the track, or it doesn't matter what we do. So raise your hand if we should switch the track under moral skepticism. Raise your hand if we should not switch the track and leave it where it is. Raise your hand if it does not matter. Yeah, exactly. So under moral skepticism, it doesn't matter. So we have 99% chance that it doesn't matter. However, when you're deciding what to do, it means that you should follow the 1% chance that you should switch the track. Because there's no downside to switching the track under moral skepticism, right? Because it says it does not matter whether you switch the track or keep it where it is. However, in the 1% chance that util is true, you'd be doing something very terrible by keeping the track where it is. And it would be much better to switch the track. So when you're deciding what to do, even if it's only a tiny chance that it's true, your only obligation would be to switch the track. Because, yeah, under skepticism, it doesn't matter what you do. Under util, it matters greatly. So even if there's just a 1% chance that it's true, you should still switch it. Questions about that?
How would you respond to that if you're running skip?
You could sort of deny that you should multiply things in this way, or that you can even be like 1% versus 99% sure of things.
Doesn't epistemic confidence answer that?
Yeah, I think or at least epistemic confidence style arguments would.
It's epistemic confidence.
Yeah. It's a bit off track. I'll just get to it quickly. So epistemic, there are 2 things. Epistemic modesty.
Is this a branch under metaethics, or is this something else?
I don't know where exactly to describe it. I guess it's kind of like applied, or like how we'd apply ethics. So maybe, yeah, I don't know exactly what it is, but when we're acting morally, are any of you 100% sure that util is true? Are any of you 100% sure that util is false? Okay, so it seems that most of us, we're kind of uncertain about what moral theory is correct, right? So, you probably think that, maybe util is 90% right, but actually deont is 5% right, virtue ethics is 3% right, and skepticism is 2% right. So we have to make choices under uncertainty, not just about what the world looks like, or like what's the right thing to do, but also what is even the right theory to use? Like what is even the right framework that we should use in evaluating these situations? Epistemic modesty says that, or actually I'll start with epistemic confidence. So like, let's say we were 90% sure util, 5% deont, or let's make it 6% deont and 4% other. Okay. Epistemic confidence says, okay, we should take whichever theory we're the most sure about and just use that. So 90% util, okay, we're gonna act as utilitarians. So that might make sense if in the 90% case, but let's say we're 50% sure, or like we're 51% sure of util, and 49% sure of deont. It would seem inappropriate to make all of our decisions as though we were utilitarians, right? Because we're really not that sure about util. We're just barely more sure about util than we are about deont. Epistemic modesty says we should look at how strong our obligation is to do or not to do something in a given situation. And then, well, basically it's that we compare across frameworks or compare across theories. So here's an example. Let's say you'd have to kill one person in order to stop the world from ending. So like aliens are coming to invade the world. They have a giant laser that will blow up the whole earth and kill everything on it. And they hand you a gun and say, okay, if you shoot this random stranger in the head and kill him, then we'll not shoot the earth with a laser. Okay, so under util, what should you do?
Shoot the person.
Yeah, you should shoot the person. And how strong is your obligation there?
Very
Exactly. So util says like it's really, really, really important that you should shoot that person in the head to save all of humanity. Deont, what would it say you should do?
Not shoot the person.
Yeah, but it's like a standard obligation. It's not like this is super, super important. Yep.
But like, isn't that nonsensical because deont by definition doesn't have strength of obligations in the first place?
Yeah, that is kind of a problem for, or that is a problem in applying epistemic modesty.
Like infinitely strong, like you can never violate it.
Yeah, there are. I haven't looked into this that much, but you should ask like Jake Niebel about this. But there are different ways of dealing with that, with like strength of obligations under deont, and when you're using epistemic modesty for comparing between deont and util. But anyway, let's just assume that under deont, that's just like, I mean, a pretty bad violation of your duty to shoot someone in the head, but it's not like it's literally the end of the world. Or actually, let's switch these around. Sorry. So even though you're more sure of deont, your obligation under util is so much stronger as to overwhelm your slight preference for deont. So it seems, so epistemic modesty in this case says that even though you're more sure about deont, under this instance, since you're uncertain about whether util or deont is correct, you should follow the much, much stronger obligation, which is your utilitarian obligation to shoot that person in the head. Yep.
So basically, it's literally like morality outweighs, or it's kind of like an outweigh argument. The impact outweighs.
I guess kind of. Like if we're sure enough about an ethical theory so that there's like substantial uncertainty between them, and like one of them says that we should definitely go one way, whereas the other theory says that we should probably go the other way, but doesn't say that strongly, we should go with a much stronger obligation. So it is, yeah, a weighing argument in a sense. Alright, sorry for the digression. Alright, so does the Pascal's wager argument make sense? So yeah, it is similar to the epistemic modesty, because, can you see the parallel here? Because like we have uncertainty about our ethical theories, and util says that we have a pretty strong obligation to switch the track, whereas skep says there's no obligation either way, so we should just take the utilitarian obligation.
But how would epistemic confidence apply in the case of skepticism? Because right, skepticism says that like, we don't have obligations. So if I was like 100% sure of skepticism, then like, what do I do?
If you're 100% sure of skepticism,
Yeah, because then I can
it doesn't matter at all what you do.
yeah. So it seems like epistemic confidence doesn't apply in the same way that it like would apply in like a non-cognitivism.
Because there's no strength of obligation under SCAP, right?
Right,
Okay,
but there is under like every other.
But under the context of the resolution, you have a burden to prove a moral obligation, which means epistemic confidence under skeptics say that there are by definition no moral obligations. So even if like there's a low risk of having a moral obligation under util, epistemic confidence would say you prefer skepticism's argument that you have no moral obligations and therefore you go nega anyway, even though there's a risk.
So if someone read like Skep, could you just read like a T-shell as like they interpret like ought means moral, like what we ought to do morally, or like
Skep is a moral argument.
but like
Yeah, I don't think that's quite responsive. Alright. I'll get in, sorry, we're running a little bit behind, so I'll quickly go through one more argument, which is just we can trust our intuition. Skep justifies, well, first of all, Skep justifies atrocities. And then the second is that moral intuitions are good. So Skep justifies atrocities, pretty simple argument. It's just, if we don't have any moral obligations, then we can't condemn things like genocide, murder, rape, anything else. Any of these terrible acts we cannot condemn at all, because under skepticism, there are no obligations, so anything goes. Does that argument make sense to everyone? So that one's very straightforward. The second is that moral intuitions are good. So the problem is that this puts undue skepticism, or people argue that moral skepticism is undue skepticism. So like, if I were to hold up my hands, I would not really have any reason to doubt that my hands are in front of me, right? Even though I can't prove that, like, I can't deductively prove that my hands are in front of me. Well, that's getting into, okay, so like I can't deductively prove that I am not in a dream, or that I'm not in a simulation or something. But we don't really have reason to doubt our intuition, nevertheless, that my hand is in front of me. In the same way, we don't have reason to doubt our moral intuitions about things like murder being wrong. And a lot of these arguments that moral skeptics make against moral intuitions, they can also be made against other intuitions. So, for example, a lot of our logical intuitions, so like what we think are true logically, for example, that, or mathematically, for example, that p equals p, so like 1 equals 1, 2 equals 2. A lot of those could also be subject to Darwinian influences, or, and we also can't get them from just looking at the world. So we don't really have any reason to doubt our moral intuitions, any more than we have reason to doubt any of our other intuitions. Does that make sense? Do you have questions about that one? That argument? Okay. Now we'll get to non-cognitivism. I'll just take a minute. Okay. Alright, so non-cognitivism is an argument about language, or a position about what moral statements express. So let's say I said, it is snowing outside. True or false? Raise your hand for true. Raise your hand for false. Okay, yeah, it is false. What about 1 plus 1 equals 2? True or false? That's true? Yeah, it's true. Alright. What about go outside? Is that true? Or raise your hand for true. Raise your hand for false. Well, okay. Why would it be false?
False. You gave some example earlier where he was like non-cognitivism that like tries to like, I guess doesn't it try to like dissuade you from doing something?
Yeah, it tries to get you, or yeah, it says, well, we'll get to that later actually, but just on this sentence, why would it be false rather than true?
No.
I have a question for you.
Yep.
But like that also, but like the thing where some like statements can't be true or false also applies to other stuff, right? If I'm like, Garber, that's like not true or false.
Yeah. Okay,
It's not a
but
moral statement either.
Yeah, that's true. Alright, so go outside. It seems that it's neither true nor false, right? You can't say go outside. Yeah, it's true, go outside. You could say it's true that it would be good for you to go outside, or maybe it's true that it would, if you were to go outside, it would be warm. But you just saying go outside, that itself cannot be true or false. So that's neither. What about yeah, actually, or like if I were to say help, like I'm in great danger right now, help, or help me, would that be true or false?
There's kind of implied that there should be like, you should help me.
Yeah, but this sentence itself, is it true or false? Or neither?
Not even a sentence.
Huh?
It's not even a sentence.
Yeah, well, okay, I guess this statement you could say. But anyway, this is another example of something being neither true nor false. So non-cognitivists think that statements like murder is bad, or you ought to help people, they think that while these may, okay, so murder is bad, would you say, is that this type of sentence where it can be true or false, or this type where it can be neither true nor false? Raise your hand if murder is bad is this type. And raise your hand if you think murder is bad is this type. Okay, yeah, so if you raise your hand for this type, then you're a moral non-cognitivist. If you raise your hand for this type, you're a cognitivist. So moral non-cognitivists say that sentences like murder is bad and you ought to help people, although they may appear to be like these types of sentences, in reality they're these types, where they're neither true nor false. So something that you'll notice about these types of sentences is that they describe something about the world. Their primary function is descriptive, not trying to get you to do something, just merely trying to get you to believe something. These types of sentences instead their primary function is not to describe the world because they don't make any description. It's instead to try to get you to do something. So like going outside or helping me, something like that. So non-cognitivists think that that's also the function of moral sentences. So they're trying to get you to do something or to not do other things. So like if I say murder is bad, that's equivalent to saying like boo murder, which is also the reason that this module is called that. So it's like I'm saying I very much disapprove of murder. It's describing something about how I feel, and it's also trying to get you to also feel that like you hate murder as well. It could also be like, don't murder. Or, yeah, actually those are the main two I can think of right now. So like if I say boo murder or don't murder, both of those would be trying to get you to do something, right? I.e. not murdering. Or take the same stance that I do about murder, which is that, disapproval. You disapprove of murder. Yeah, so that's the basic breakdown of non-cognitivism. It says these sentences, they're trying to get you to do something, trying to get you to have a certain state of approval or disapproval, certain emotions about actions or states of affairs, instead of trying to describe anything about them. Do people have questions about that so far? Yeah.
What are the authors we should look to for this?
There's like R.M. Hare, A.J. Ayer, and R.L. Stevenson. Alright, I'll give a quick rundown of some arguments for non-cognitivism, and then we can discuss general strategies of how these are applied to debate, and how you can argue against them. So, first argument 4 is actually I won't get to that one yet. So if you're interested in this one, look up logical positivism, or A.J. Ayer and non-cognitivism. I won't get into that argument skepticism. For example, remember how I said earlier that one really weird thing about ethics or like moral sentences like murder is bad is that it's trying to get to motivate you to do something? Yeah, so one easy explanation for that is that instead of moral sentences being descriptive, there are sentences like these. Sentences like these can motivate you to do something, right? They get you to feel something, for example, disapproval of murder, or they can make you feel that you are compelled to go outside based on my command. So they do have a motivational force. And so non-cognitivism gives a very simple explanation for Mackey's problem about motivation. Because when I say murder is bad, I'm not describing anything, I'm instead trying to motivate you to not murder. Sorry, that was a big convoluted. Any questions about that one? You look kind of confused, Gabby.
Yeah, I'm really confused, but I don't know how to ask the question to clarify it.
Okay. Alright, so under morality, when I tell you that murder is bad, that's supposed to motivate you in some way to not murder, right? Like, that's what makes a moral sentence different from something that's, or what makes something, a prescriptive sentence different from something merely descriptive. Like if I were to say, people murder right now, does that motivate you? Does that necessarily motivate you? No, it just describes something about the world. But if I were to say, murder is bad, or you ought not murder, that is supposed to motivate you to do something. Or it is supposed to tell you something about your moral obligations, and to then get you to stop murdering.
What if it doesn't though?
Well, it might not, but the point of moral sentences is that knowing moral fact is supposed to also motivate you to not pursue that course of action, because otherwise, like, there'd be no way for people to do anything moral, because they would not also be motivated to do so. Sorry.
It's early in the morning, it's fine.
Okay, you come to me after in Socrates hours, because, yeah, I don't have a ton of time for this. Another one is that, this one is from R.L. Stevenson, that he thinks that when people disagree about moral statements, they're not really trying to, or there's no really objective metric to determine which of their statements is true. They're just describing different preferences that they have. So for example, if I told you, let's say, I want to go to McDonald's, and then you said, like, oh, actually, I want to go to In-N-Out. We're not describing anything, or like we're describing something about ourselves, but really when we're saying I want to go to X place and you say I want to go to Y place, we're just trying to convince each other to go to different places, even though these are just preferences and we cannot appeal to any deductive argument for them. So like I could not give you a full argument for why you want to go to McDonald's rather than In-N-Out. At its base, it comes down to different preferences. And by saying I want to go to In-N-Out or I want to go to McDonald's, I'm just trying to change those preferences that you have. So Stevenson thinks that moral sentences are also this way, in that when you say them, you're just trying to change someone's preferences to do or not to do something instead of describing anything about the world, even though ostensibly it looks like a descriptive sentence, just in the same way as I want to go to McDonald's also looks descriptive. Do we have questions about that one? Alright. Okay, so let's go into how these apply to debate. In debate, these arguments can be used as what are called necessary but insufficient burdens. Can someone explain what that means? Yeah.
Yeah, it's an argument that the app or whatever has to answer, but if they answer it, they can't get any offense on it. So like topicality within an RPI is usually a nib.
Can you explain how these would be nibs?
Yeah,
or-
so let's say like I debate someone and I read like 7 minutes of moral skepticism. If they like read back the skepticism but I have like offense somewhere else, it's not a reason why they win because of offense on skepticism. It just means like, cool, you want skepticism, now you can win your other stuff.
why is it true that you can't win off with moral skepticism?
Because if you disprove skepticism, it's not like skepticism like can affirm or it's not like you can gain offense off of skepticism. Because the entire point is that you don't have like a moral obligation. That makes sense.
Proving that morality exists is insufficient to prove that, like, under like a particular system of morality, you ought to do a particular action, or like that act. Proving that morality exists is not enough for you to win that doing the resolution is moral.
Yeah.
So it's two burdens you have.
Yeah, exactly. So, so under this resolution, you're supposed to prove that Japan ought to amend its constitution, right? Someone reads moral skepticism, they say, well, that can't be true because we don't have moral obligations, so it can't be true that Japan has any obligations, including an obligation to amend its constitution. Now, suppose that you're at the app and going against this. If you merely prove that Japan does have obligations, is that sufficient to prove that it ought to amend its constitution?
It just shows you can like debate the route.
Exactly. So it's kind of like a prerequisite to getting any of your offense or getting any reason for why Japan ought to amend its constitution. But it doesn't guarantee that you win the round if you beat back skepticism. So yeah. So that's why moral skepticism and non-cognitivism can be kind of strategic, because they are necessary but insufficient burdens. In that there are if you're running them on the neg, there are no risk issues, because the app both has to prove that morality exists or that the resolution is even meaningful, and they need to prove that if the resolution is meaningful, it affirms. Does that make sense? Okay, so yeah. Like another way to visualize this is that AF needs to beat skep and anything else.
Shouldn't like skep and like presumption or something? People do that.
Yeah. Whereas the neg only needs to do skep or anything else.
Could you read like skep and Kant or something? And say like, oh, you know, if morality doesn't exist, it's skep, but if it does exist, then it's Kant.
Yeah, you could.
Okay.
Like what?
Alright. So why I think that you should probably not run skepticism and non-cognitivism as nibs is that, necessary but insufficient burdens are also called nibs, is that it's extremely sketchy. This is like the classic example of a sketchy debater. If they run skepticism on you, then judges will just be like, oh yeah, this is a sketchy debater. So it'll really discredit you. Here are some more strategic ways of thinking about them. Instead of directly using moral skepticism or non-cognitivism, instead you should use them as reasons to prefer your framework, or takeouts to other things. Moral skepticism in particular. So you can say, well, first of all, I didn't talk about this really, but there are frameworks that are not quite realist quite, but also aren't skeptical. So these are what are called constructivist theories. So you can leverage some of the arguments from moral skepticism for why realism is false, and yet still use them to support your framework. So constructivist theories say that morality, it doesn't correspond to any absolute facts about the world, but rather that we construct it. So it can be very useful if you're defending a constructivist theory, for example, to use skeptical arguments for why realism is false and why there are no absolute moral facts, or like moral facts are just out there independent of humans, and yet walk the middle line and say that constructivism is true. So we still have moral obligations, yet they can't be realist. So why this would be useful is that it can, at the highest layer, take out frameworks like util, because util assumes realism. Another useful way is that there are many other arguments for skepticism. A lot of these will be like, morality requires X, and then like there is no X. That's the form that a lot of skeptical arguments take. So for example, morality requires morality requires perfect moral intuitions that aren't influenced by outside forces, but there are no moral intuitions that are not influenced by outside forces because there are evolutionary pressures. Or another example is morality requires that we can, or morality requires that we have some special way of receiving moral knowledge, but there is no special way of receiving moral knowledge, which is one of Mackey's arguments. So you can use this sort of structure to actually support your framework, because you can say, instead of there is no x, there is x, but only my framework has it. So we can give the example, we can sort of give the realism example again here. So morality requires that, or actually another way is like, there is no x, but my framework doesn't need it. So the constructivism example I gave before is morality requires realism, or most moral theories require realism, but realism is false. But my framework doesn't require realism because it's constructivist. Another example is like morality requires that it's unconditionally binding. So like you have to follow it in every single instance. And then you would argue that there are moral theories that have unconditionally bindingness, and that moral theory is just mine.
What's an example of a constructivist framework that people don't think?
I gotta say, I'm not really an expert in constructivism. I think that like Hobbes is one. Various derivations of Kantianism are also constructivist. So you can, I've never seen anyone do this, but leverage, like constructivism on Kantianism using with moral skepticism. So so basically what you can do is you can pose a problem for morality and then propose that only your framework can solve it. And otherwise it would collapse to some form of moral skepticism. That is strategic because it gives you a very strong weighing argument. So let's say that they poke a bunch of holes in your framework and they say, your framework is flawed for X, Y, Z reason. You can leverage one of these types of arguments as a very strong counterweight to those ones. So like, let's say your framework is flawed because let's say you're defending util and your opponent says, your framework is flawed because it's hard to calculate things. We can't tell the difference between two headaches and a migraine, and maybe one other problem. Those are all very superficial problems with a framework, right? Because they merely explain why it's hard to apply or something like that. Leveraging an argument like this gives you a very strong weighing argument because you can say, yes, maybe my framework has a lot of small problems with it. You can poke a lot of little holes in it. Nevertheless, it's the only way to avoid skepticism, which would basically destroy any other framework and make it impossible to have moral obligations. Do people understand that weighing argument? All right, we don't have much time. I'll just get to one more thing. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Just in the example you did there, you had like util as the framework that was like not biting the bullet on being skep, or like meeting whatever requirement. Are there versions of util that are like that, or?
Yeah, so you could say, this isn't quite skep, but there's an argument about how moral theories must be based on certain physical causes, or like physical features of the world, such as chemicals in the brain, as util would say. And then you could say that only util does that. So that would be one example. Because it allows you to say that like morality requires that it's based on physical causes. And that those moral physical causes exist, but only my framework util has it. A final thing to look up, I don't really have time to go over this because we have to go soon, is comparative worlds. This is a way of dealing with nibs, mainly in LD. If you're interested in this, look up Adam Nelson. It's just called Towards a Comprehensive Theory of LD. Something like that. And the other one is John Scoggin and Bob Overing. and that one's called In Defense of Inclusion. Both of those are very debate specific.